Theory and argument.
Hello, for my final presentation, I would like to share my W paper and what I've done to find the conclusion that I've found. To start, I would like to talk about intersectionality of climate change. Intersectionality, developed by American lawyer Kimberly Crenshaw, is defined in her words as, intersectionality is a lens through which you can see power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. It is not simply a race problem here, and a gender problem here, and a LGBT or class problem there. Many times it's a framework that erases what happens to people who are subjugated to all these things. J. Storrs defines intersectionality as the interactive social identity structures such as race, class, and gender, in fostering life experiences, especially experience of privilege and oppress. The theory of this paper is that due to intersectionality, the white elite, due to their security, experiences climate change disproportionately than minority groups. To add to this, the Western elite have an apathetic view of climate change due to their privilege and toxic masculinity's nature. The argument of this paper is that while climate change is an undeniable fact, many privileged people refuse to acknowledge climate change because climate change disproportionately affects people who are underprivileged. Climate change directly impacts underdeveloped agricultural societies like the farming communities of Africa and Latin America due to droughts, as well as black and brown communities due to systemic racism caused by the location of these communities having the lacking infrastructure to prevent natural disasters like the New Orleans Hurricane Katrina and the Puerto Rican Hurricane Maria. On the other hand, the white elites view climate change through an apathetic lens because providing infrastructure to minority groups or converting factories to use greenhouse energy instead of carbon-emitting ones would cost money. It is not because apathy and the economy are two distinct issues, but one that is connected. These are not distinct factors of feeling versus economic gain, but one overall apathetic mentality. Climate change is viewed apathetically because of the fact that poor non-white cultures more than rich Western cultures. This also deals with the topic of intersectionality and how societal discriminations create a web of discrimination that focus on several factors instead of just one. Economic stability provides privilege to not be affected by climate change. It provides security that allows millionaires to focus on obscure goals like space travel instead of domestic issues, as well as societal issues with toxic masculinity that creates a culture where it's perceived as cool not to care about others, which expands to rich white men also being racist, homophobic, and misogynistic. The apathy of rich white men creates a society in which non-white women and queer communities are hurt the worst by climate change.
What I found out.
Going into this class, I thought that developing nations like China and India, who mainly burn wood and fossil fuels for energy, were the main causes of climate change. While in the Western world, who have a smaller population and have made efforts towards solar, wind, and nuclear energy, were not to blame. However, the reason most Western nations have a relatively low carbon footprint is because they abuse other nations to gain this, by shipping garbage or having their factories overseas. In the systemic crisis of global climate change, it states, despite how Caribbean nations have a relatively low emission per capita, this region is nevertheless facing rising sea levels. In the meantime, the USA is the leading source of greenhouse gases. When we take into account what some have called outsourcing emissions, that release greenhouse gases in other areas of the world that manufacture products that are exported to the USA. To add on to this, in 2013, Canada shipped over 103 shipping containers of garbage to the Philippines, saying that they contained recyclable material, which could be reused. Instead, the shipping containers contain a large amount of household waste, which is toxic and non-biodegradable. But since they had signed an agreement to take them before they knew what was inside, the Canadian government refused to have them shipped back. In the meantime, several of these shipping containers were buried in the Philippines to prevent short-term damage. The dispute continued into 2019, where the remaining shipping containers were sent back to Canada. However, the ones that were buried continue to pollute the Philippine soil to this day. Systemic racism from the white elite has led to developing nations to experience climate change faster, but it also affects minority communities drastically. Climate change also increases the likelihood of natural disasters such as hurricanes and floods. In areas that are affected by those storms, those areas that contain communities with people of color are far less likely to receive media attention, support, and money to rebuild their communities. Hurricane Maria was a massive storm that blew speeds which reached 175 miles per hour, as well as had consistent torrential downpour. This devastated the Caribbean, mainly Puerto Rico, who had their islands slammed by the storm. Hurricane Maria happened in 2017, and many of the communities in Puerto Rico have not been rebuilt, or the people compensated. In 2004, Hurricane Katrina broke the levee in Louisiana and devastated many poor black communities that were forced to live in the area due to historical segregation. many people received no or insufficient aid from the United States. And still to this day, almost 20 years later, these areas are still destroyed, cars still in trees. For many poor people in Louisiana, this is their home, in which they and now their children have to live in. They can't go anywhere else. This compared to how white communities that are affected by this, or tourist resorts in the Caribbean, are completely radical. Black homeowners in Louisiana after Katrina received $8,000 less per family in government aid than white homeowners. In 2013, about 80% of black people in the 9th Ward, the area hit the hardest by the levee, had not returned to their community due to inadequate rebuilding by the government. The white elite is also plagued with toxic masculinity, which increases the amount of homophobia in politics, which greatly impacts queer communities. Queer communities are disproportionately affected by climate change due to societal discrimination. 5 to 10% of the United States youth are homeless. However, 20 to 40% of LGBTQ+ youth are homeless. This is due to queer people being more likely to be kicked out of their homes for coming out, as well as being evicted from their homes due to homophobic landowners. Also, the United States does not have sufficient discrimination laws, which can lead to people being fired for being queer or not being hired to begin with. LGBTQ+ people, especially trans youth, are also much more likely to be sexually abused and harassed, which can lead to severe PTSD and drug abuse. This greatly increases the chance of being homeless. Since LGBTQ+ people have a higher chance of being homeless, they are impacted by climate change due to being vulnerable to the elements. Since climate change can lead to forest fires, hurricanes, and blizzards, those who do not have the luxury of being sheltered are drastically more impacted by these natural disasters. This homophobic mentality is without a doubt a byproduct of toxic masculinity. A gay or trans man is the opposite of the stereotypical American male. Because of this, they are demonized. The LGBTQ+ communities do not conform to the traditional gender roles and nuclear family stereotypes. So, through this, homophobia is justified by religion, fear, and ignorance, which creates a society that is apathetic and resorts to discrimination.
Why it matters.
Since white communities have the money, privilege, and support from a racist society, corporations cannot get away with building factories close to the communities. This causes immigrants and people of color to suffer. An infamous example of this is the Dakota Pipeline accident. The Dakota Access Pipeline is a large oil pipeline that is designed to transport 500,000 barrels of oil daily from the American Midwest to the American South. According to ABC, the original plan was to build the pipeline through white and non-indigenous communities. However, this plan was rejected in order to prevent water in the interest of the citizens. It was then rerouted on indigenous land, which entirely defeats the purpose of Indian reservations as a safe place for indigenous people to govern themselves. Don't forget that while there are many indigenous tribes that have origins in the Dakotas, many tribes were forced there due to manifest destiny. This reroute received massive pushback from the media and indigenous people nationwide. This is because the Indigenous Environmental Network has played a leading role in addressing climate change and a range of interrelated ecological issues. Approaching such struggles with a social inequality lens to help link the conditions faced by natives, Latinos, and members of the African diaspora, according to Black, page 176. However, this was not respected, and the pipeline was constructed directly through the indigenous communities. Reverend Jesse Jackson, a known American activist, said, "The Dakota Pipeline is the ripest case of environmental racism I've seen in a long time." It is immeasurable to talk about intersectionality without bringing up my own privilege and how that affects my opinions. I am a white straight male living a middle-class life in the United States. The privilege I possess of this is immeasurable. I have never personally dealt with serious racism, sexism, or homophobia. While I'm privileged to not have the first-hand experience of discrimination, I can also use my privilege to testify for the existence of toxic masculinity in the United States. I have personally known many people whose personality and social acceptance is solely based on what material possessions they have, how many women they have slept with. I can also testify how I see these same actions in hormonal teenage boys as American politicians, furthering the thesis that the Western elite is corrupt with toxic masculinity and apathy. Also including the issues of toxic masculinity, many young white men purposely buy the most harmful trucks in order to seem cool to their peers. The average young white male in the United States has been trained from a young age to drive big trucks, harass women, and treat men who do not conform to these stereotypes with disrespect in in order to earn respect. Donald Trump is the embodiment of the stereotypical alpha male. He's a billionaire, talks with confidence, openly supports being rude to women through locker room talk, as well as many more stereotypes of the perfect, cool American male. In 2016, if only white men voted, only the states of Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, Oregon, and Washington would have been blue states, with a total of 493 electoral votes going to Donald Trump. Toxic masculinity culture in America creates men that are apathetic to others and others' issues. Without destroying this corrupt system at the heart, systemic issues will continue to plague our modern world. Other personal ways to help minority groups who are being disproportionately affected by climate change would be to support black business, give aid to queer communities, and listen to women when talking about women's issues. Unless drastic change can occur, climate change, due to the white elite, will continue to disproportionately affect minority groups.